everyone. You're watching the Asian American Herald, a new media network featuring the Asian Americans in the capital region of New York. You can also watch a recording of this show and all of our previous episodes from our Facebook page, Asian American Herald of the Capital District. My name is Shruti Natanmai, and I'm a student at the Fashion Institute of Technology, writer and creative who's born and raised in the capital region. Tonight, we're honored to speak with David Bissember, the 2019 Troy City Council presidential candidate and former representative of District 5 on the Troy City Council. He was also the chair of the Public Safety and General Services Committees. David, welcome to our show.
Shruti, thanks so much for having me.
It's our pleasure. So I'd like to start by asking you to take a minute to introduce yourself a little bit more and tell our viewers about your background, like where did you grow up, what are some of your interests?
Great, yeah. So like you said, thank you so much for having me on. I'm David Bissember. I grew up in here in the capital region. I grew up in the town of Cobleskill, and I've lived in Troy now for almost a decade, and been living in and around the capital region for some time. I was a former city council, as you noted, formerly on the Troy City Council, and went to school locally, and now am doing more community organizing work in the future. Yes.
That's great. So did you have a clear idea of the career you wanted to pursue from a young age, or did you kind of figure that out along the way?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, I was someone who, I never actually felt like, I never thought I would be involved in politics. It wasn't something that was familiar to me. It wasn't something around me. But I knew I always liked people and getting involved in good work. And so for me, it took me a long time to get to where I am. I studied locally. One of my biggest interests was studying language. So I was a Spanish language major at Siena College, got my education there, went to public school in Cobleskill. And when I got an interest in city council work, I saw that there was a lack of representation from community members. I myself identify as a West Indian American. My family comes from Guyana and the U.S. Virgin Islands, so a lot of the parts of the West Indies or the Caribbean. And when I looked around, I didn't see representation from people of color, from different community groups. And when that happens, I think it puts us in a place where sometimes our voices don't matter. And so for me, it was making sure I could elevate, all try to be more inclusive in the work that we're doing in the city council and being an inclusive city for everybody. And that's sort of where my passions come from.
Yeah, that's awesome. Do you feel that you're majoring in Spanish, that background kind of helped you get to where you are today?
Yeah, it's so funny because I think growing up, I never knew what exactly I wanted to do. I was good at math, I was good at Spanish, and I didn't really want to be a teacher. Actually, I just liked the language, and so for me, I think it was really important. As a young person, I think ultimately what I think is important is doing the things that you're passionate about, finding things that interest you, and then a career will come along in whatever ways it does. For me, as a Spanish major, I had the opportunity and privilege to live in Spanish-speaking countries. After graduating, I did use my languages I did ultimately teach for a couple years in Spain, and I've lived in Chile as well, practicing my language work. And then what it really did is it helped me connect with people, being able to communicate with different people, maybe that weren't already in my networks. And in that capacity, it certainly was a huge help to the work that I do, which is really just about bringing people together, elevating issues, and doing things in a collective way for the community.
Definitely. Yeah. And so going along with that, so when you did run for Troy City Council president, so what inspired you to run for that position, and what were you campaigning on?
Yeah. So I was, at that point when I announced I was running for city council president, I was already a sitting city council member in a local district. I represented South Troy, Little Italy, different communities in my district. And as public safety chair, I did a lot of work handling public safety issues related to the fire department, the police department, law enforcement, our EMTs and the works. And so that kind of work, I realized I took on a leadership role in my conference during my 2 years in office, and really growing from an idea that I felt like there were communities, neighborhoods that were underrepresented on the council and in the public body. I thought I had the right tools and messaging and experience actually too to bring those voices to a citywide race. Now, for your audience that maybe have questions about local politics, I was a 2-term legislator. I was representing, a small group of folks in the broader city. And then so not only was I expanding that group, I was running citywide, which means I was talking to a lot more people. But what I was trying to do was bring all of the values and work that I'd been doing for the 2 years on the council and elevate those issues to the broader community. And some of those issues that I most focused on were, issues about neighborhood revitalization, but also specifically about inclusion. I was the prime sponsor of the Sanctuary City Resolution in the city of Troy, where we were trying to make sure we were a city that was inclusive and protecting our immigrant neighbors in our communities and making sure that their constitutional amendments were protected. And so a lot of that work was after meeting with community members and building a coalition of folks who are interested and passionate to make change in our city. And so for local politics, there's a lot you can do. You can, I think a lot of my experience in college, where I learned about, social justice issues, and I was a labor organizer after that. There's a lot of those kinds of passions that I think are important and meaningful to bring to the local level. And for me, local politics is where you can do the most. So those were the issues I elevated. Focus on our immigrant, all of our people in the city, as well as making our neighborhoods more represented in politics.
For sure. And do you feel that the city of Troy, or even just the capital region as a whole, do you feel that we've made progress in being more inclusive?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we must address what's going on currently right now with the Black Lives Matter movement and the death of George Floyd at the hands of a police officer. I think we are, as a country, we're in this moment of reckoning, of understanding our issues of systemic racism in our country. And I think a lot of that is playing out locally in a lot of different ways. So, for example, for me, when I made efforts to have a sanctuary resolution, which we ultimately passed the city council, but was vetoed by the mayor, ultimately with an executive order protecting immigrants, which was a great thing. We were able to secure that in our city. But what we were up against was a response to this sort of nasty rhetoric against immigrants, against people in our neighborhoods at the national level, and it played out very specifically in Rensselaer County, where we have a county government that established a relationship with the federal ICE Immigration Enforcement Agency to deputize 2 of their county officers to serve as ICE agents. And so that intermingling of federal and county rules and powers really put our community members at risk. And so the work that we were doing was in response to some of that nasty rhetoric. And I will say, I think looking at where we are now, I think there is this moment that we are seeing community members coming together, not only with these mass movements that are happening all across, not just the country, but around here in the city of Troy. Black-led organizers successfully created a protest with 11,000 people that came to our city. It received national attention. I think it was on the Racial Mad Out program. And so that was a really inspiring moment where we realized it's it's not the politicians that are, that are the ones leading the way. It's really these movements and community organizations that are developing these strategies, and people like me, we're trying to follow along, right? That's what it's always about. Is if you're a good public servant, you want to be listening to the community at large. And so for me, it's always been about how do I use my political capital that I've gained through these elections and invest that capital into building multiracial, community-led organizations that are working at the local level. And so that's the work that I've been interested in, passionate in.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, speaking on the Troy protest, that was incredible. I've lived here all my life, and I've never seen anything quite like that. It was really great to witness and be part of, and I thought it was really powerful to see so many people come together.
And I just on that, if you don't mind, I think it was a really great moment, and it was really special for a lot of people. And I wanna make sure that when we're looking at this, we think there was so much behind the scenes work involved with community organizers that were training safety teams to make sure everybody in the community was protected, handing out masks and making sure social distancing was happening where it could, having all those public health needs involved, and having legal observers being trained and on the ground to make sure people's rights were being protected. There was a lot of work with Black-led organizations in the community that were working on these issues. And so I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the work that they did to make it such a successful moment. And we've been seeing all of those efforts, not just in Troy, but in Schenectady and in Albany and in all of the surrounding communities as well, and all across upstate New York as well, if we're speaking broadly.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good thing to bring up, because when people think of these protests or watch them happen on the news and whatnot, a lot of people don't think about what goes on behind the scenes to make sure that they happen safely and effectively. And yeah, I think that's very important to mention. So thank you. So do you feel that your background that I know you mentioned previously, do you feel that it influenced your campaign or the values or ideas that you were campaigning on?
Yeah, so I think in terms of my background, a lot of the things I was drawing from was my more longer work of community organizing, which is, I think, sort of had iterations in my life and my professional work in different ways. After graduating and coming back to my community, I worked. One of the first jobs I got out of college was working with NYPIRG, the New York Public Information Research Group. I think I got their acronym right. They're an organization that does a lot of, they have a lot of issues related to environmental issues that they focus on. And at the time they were working on, making sure we prevented hydrofracking from coming into our communities. And so I started my work there as a community canvasser. In fact, I was canvassing in Troy before I was even involved in elected politics. So, the work of community organizers is directly related to, the work of political organizing. Ultimately what organizing is about is finding out what issues are going on in a community, figuring out ways to mobilize and engage those members in a meaningful way, and finding a solution to whatever it is you're looking for. So, for example, I've also got professional work in the labor movement. I was for 10 months, I worked as a labor organizer with the nurses union and helped to successfully have an election where we had 2/3 of nurses voting in favor of authorizing a union contract to have their own representation in their workplace. And so, from all these different kinds of jobs, I realized the things that I was most interested in was helping people and finding out ways that I could communicate those needs to other groups and organize around those ways. So be it in the labor movement, be it in, grassroots organizing on environmental issues, or at, at a community level as well, just neighborhood issues, right? Like just going to your neighborhood meetings at the local level and realizing, we don't have our parks aren't being taken care of, or our streets aren't being invested in, and they're falling apart. A lot of that work happens at the local level, and it's why it's so, for me, local politics is the most meaningful, because you really have an opportunity to affect change. We in the city council in Troy, we're a legislative body of 7 members, and the deliberations have big consequences for the community, right? We are authorizing bonds. We're basically saying we're going to pay for certain kinds of things, and what do we want to put our dollars towards, and how are we going to prioritize issues. It's also an opportunity to elevate those social justice issues I was talking about, be it through introducing resolutions such as I did on the sanctuary movement, or implementing changes to the local code, which is through an ordinance or a local law. These are all the different tools legislators have to affect change. And so those are the things that I think are really important about the work that I brought along with me, and how it's always about making sure we're being inclusive, getting community input, and driving forward in successful ways. If I might just add one thing I'm very proud of is my work on environmental issues. I was the prime sponsor of the Plastic-Free Hudson River Act in Troy, where the goal was to reduce the amount of plastic and polystyrene that goes into our waste systems by banning polystyrene and opting into a program of putting a 5-cent fee on paper bags as the New York State plastic bag ban was going into effect, and also reducing plastic straw use throughout the city. So it was something I was able to introduce, and I mentioned there's 7 members of the council. I got bipartisan unanimous support on that project, and we ultimately passed it, and it became law. And we're working on I'm out of city government now, but the administration's working on the implementation now.
That's incredible. That's such an important thing to discuss and talk about, and that's just a huge part of today's that should be spoken about a lot more than I feel like it is, and it's that's very important. So congratulations. That's amazing. So as you said, all your decisions, whether it be environmental or social, they have a lot. The local government has a lot of power and influence. What did it feel like being in that position, knowing that your decision could impact so many people?
Yeah, it was scary. Just to be honest, it was a scary thing to stand up in front of people, at meetings, and speak your mind and share your opinions, and have people listen to them and take the criticism and deliberate on that. It's not easy, but I'll say, it's important, right? And I don't want to discourage people from it, because it's so important to do this. For me personally, it was very scary. I'm actually, as in so many ways, I'm sort of an extrovert. I am an introvert in a lot of ways too. I have a hard time in some, with public speaking, for example, or just interacting in groups sometimes. And so for me, it was a little difficult getting out of my shell. But all of that sort of work, all those concerns sort of go away when you realize why it is you're doing what you're doing, right? That we're doing this work to improve people's lives. I believe that local government, I believe all government is designed to improve the lives of the people that it represents. And so for me, that was the sort of driving philosophy behind the work that I was doing. But public speaking, it was not easy. I did in high school actually take a public speaking course, which actually ended up preparing me for this. So it's like, maybe I knew what I was getting involved in, and I didn't realize it.
No, public speaking's hard. Especially when there's people watching you. Sometimes you know what you're trying to say, but it just leaves your mind. But so if it wasn't public speaking, what would you say was the most difficult part of running for Troy City Council president?
Yeah, I think the most difficult part was sort of setting aside the critics, because I think in politics, especially for people of color, especially for women, that there are so many obstacles to even getting to the point of running for city council president or for any elected position. I'm a registered Democrat, and I received the endorsements of the Democratic and Working Families parties. And for me, that meant I had to go and do these interviews with these political parties, and I didn't know a lot of the folks in there. And also, quite frankly, at least with the local Democratic Party, there were no people of color in that room when I had my first interview. So, that kind of lack of representation can be quite daunting, and understanding that what it is we're trying to accomplish. So for me, I think the most challenging part for running for the council president was to say, I've got the experience. I've worked in these kinds of things. I've done these issues. I've worked on these kinds of issues. I have just as much ability to do it as anyone else. And I think for me, that's the most important message to drive through. Is like we live in this sort of in society now where we have, especially at the national level, politics is so expensive. You need a lot of money to run a campaign, and that means you're reaching out to a lot of people maybe you won't be interested in reaching out to. So I think there's so many challenges with the ways of doing things and making sure your voice is heard. And for me, it's about making sure those people who don't already exist in politics right now have a space. And so for me, that's always driving me when I'm thinking about what these concerns are. And the idea is we need to continue to make space for different community members, for people who aren't being represented in our community. And I think for me, that was always really important to the work that I was doing.
Definitely. And do you feel that those obstacles that you mentioned kind of discourage other people of color for running for these positions?
Yes, unfortunately they do. I mean, and I'm someone who I identify as a person of color, but I also had all of these experiences working in government. So I did spend 5 years working in the New York State legislature. I did a lot of communications work during my time there. And from that work, I started to learn about organizing and political campaigns and doing all of these kinds of things. But for the average person, they don't know what it takes to run a campaign, and they don't know what the process is. And I think that's part of the problem of our local leaders, or all of our political leaders, is how do we make this easier for people to understand so they know that they have a place in this realm, in this political sphere. And so yes, it's gonna always be challenging, but what some of the community organizing work I try to focus on is figuring out ways to identify what I've learned and share it with other people. And so for me, that means making sure I'm active in my community, neighborhood organizations. We have a lot of active neighborhood groups in our city, and there's a lot of people that are organizing about a lot of different things. And so I bring the knowledge and experience from the legislature, and I think you rightly did describe it as this place of power, and I use that power and those knowledge that I learned from this process to give it back to community members, to empower people to make sure they know that they have the tools and support to run a campaign, and to support each other. It's all about making sure we create space for more people, and that's the way we make change in our communities and our society.
Right, that's great. So we talked about the most difficult part. What do you feel was the most rewarding part of running for Troy City Council president?
Yeah, I think it's making people's lives better, and it's it's the things that I advocated for. At the local level, it's not all all of these big issues. Sometimes it's smaller issues that have a real meaning to the people in the neighborhoods. And so for me, making Troy a more inclusive, but also a more walkable city, a more bikeable city, a place where people can connect from the different neighborhoods that exist. And a lot of the work I did was advocating to have stop signs installed in dangerous intersections, and advocating for right-of-ways for bikes, and for ADA compliance to make sure our community members who have wheelchairs have that accessibility going through our neighborhoods. It's about connecting residents with residents, and for me, it's just making the idea of making people's lives better, and in whatever ways we can.
Yeah, and I think even if an issue seems small, it could make all the difference in another person's life. So I feel like no issue is too small to address.
That's great. Yeah, that's exactly right. I even add one of the other pieces of legislation I got successfully passed was an ordinance to reduce the amount of fees people were charged when their dogs were impounded. And we use the Mohawk, the Hudson Mohawk Humane Society as our dog catching organization. And so when a dog goes loose, it goes out into the neighborhood. Our local city worker will pick it up, bring it to the Hudson Mohawk, and it was so expensive for the resident to get their dog back. And it cost, I think it was $400 to get your dog back from the pound, and then it cost a little less if you had a licensed dog. So I was like, nobody who has a dog and if you're a working person can afford that. That's like saying, do I pay for rent this month or do I pick up my dog? And so that was something that was a really easy fix. I said, let's cut this down. I worked with our city clerk. She provided an analysis of fiscal impact, and we made the budget work, and we reduced it to, I think it was $75. And you go in, you can get your dog at a more affordable rate and reunite community members. It's issues like that where we look like and say, look, we have an opportunity to make people's lives better. And so that was something I was really excited about.
For sure. That's awesome. That's a pretty significant reduction too. That's great.
And we ended up finding out actually through the implementation of the policy, because I think there were some critics that said if you lower the price, it's going to hurt our revenues. What we ended up ultimately seeing is more people actually registered their dogs because they were paying attention to this issue, and so they were more likely to collect their dog and pay the fee, where some people were actually not paying the fee. So on the economic scale, it actually ended up balancing out too, which was exciting.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's something that I feel like a lot of people don't even think about when they think about local issues. I feel like I don't think a dog, like rescues and pounds, would ever come into conversation, but that's great that you're talking about that, because that would obviously make a huge difference in someone's life.
That's right.
With a pet, so that's great. So we are running a little short on time, so I have one last question for you. So many young voters, including myself, are not as familiar with local politics as they are with what occurs on the national stage. So what tips do you have for young people in order for them to get more acquainted with local issues, elections, and the candidates who are running?
That's a great question, and I think my response would be to going back to the issues about what are you most passionate about. There are so many ways to get involved in your local municipality, wherever the city you live in, the town you live in, and advocate for things that are meaningful for you. If you're a dog owner and your city doesn't have a dog park, get on a dog park committee and start organizing your neighbors to try to get one in your neighborhood. If you get involved in your neighborhood organizations. There's issues that are going on the ground level that are really meaningful, and it's really important to do that kind of work. Or find a club, find a hobby, make the issue that you are interested in, make it matter to other people, and that's what it's really about. It's if you see that there's something you're inspired about and you don't see anyone talking about it locally, go find your council person or your mayor and bring it up to them. These people in these positions of power represent you, and they represent all young people too. And so make sure you're doing those things. I would also say register to vote. Make sure people are registered. The only way we have power is through, and not the only way, but one way we have power is through voting. And so that is a really meaningful thing for people to do. Get involved in a political party. Find if one doesn't exist that you agree with, create a new one. There's ways to do that too. So there's always hope and ways that we can make change in our cities and our communities. And it's just about finding what you're passionate about and rolling with it.
That's great. That's great advice. Thank you so much. Thank you for speaking with us today. That was I'm so honored to speak with you. You've accomplished so much.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm I'm really privileged to be here, and I'm thank you for the work that you're doing, because we live in a time where information is not always getting out there. So it's really important that the work that you're doing, and I want to make sure I acknowledge that.
Thank you so much. It was an honor. Well, thank you again. So I'm Shruti Natanmai, and our wonderful guest for today was David Bissember. The Asian American Herald is a Facebook-based news media outlet dedicated to discussing topics and building community amongst the Asian Americans in the Capital Region. Please send us your story ideas and look for the recording of this show and all of our previous ones on our Facebook page. Thank you so much and have a good evening.
Thank you.